When Mandy awoke from her 6-year coma, everyone was tense with anticipation. Her family thought that she might never wake up, but Eric had always held out hope. Eric, her boyfriend of many years, was one of the first to meet her gaze, yet, to his surprise, instead of being happy to see him, she appeared to be enraged. He quickly figured out why. Breathless, Eric walked into Mandy's room. The doctors informed him that she would soon wake up from her coma, a coma in which she had been plunged for 6 years now. Eric was afraid of how she would react when she saw him. Would she remember everything that had happened? Was she going to blame him? He saw her eyes open slowly. Eric had heard stories of people who could still hear while in a coma. Was that the case for Mandy? He was incredibly nervous. When Mandy realized where she was and what had happened, her eyes began to scan the room and stopped when they met Eric's, and he could immediately see her expression change. The only visible emotion on Mandy's face was anger. Eric felt like his worst fears have come true. She knows, but what had triggered this reaction from Mandy? Did she overhear something about Eric in her coma? Or was something else going on? Mandy and Eric had been together for 2.5 years, and they were no ordinary couple. They weren't living under the same roof yet, but they were starting to talk about it. They were only 19 and 21 respectively at the time, so they were in no rush. They were just enjoying their time together. But Mandy and Eric weren't prepared for the consequences of some of their actions. They loved to do extreme sports together and live so many potentially dangerous and sometimes even deadly adventures. They're both out of college and earning their own money full-time, so they can spend whatever they want on their wild travels. And they always try to up the ante. Together they went mountaineering, skydiving, and they even dived in shark cages in order to get closer to the great white sharks. For Mandy and Eric, life couldn't be exciting enough, but not everyone was as excited about their lifestyle as the couple themselves. Their parents hated that they put themselves in danger like this and had spoken out against it many times in the past. But the couple didn't care about anyone's opinion on the matter. Anyway, nothing had really gone wrong yet. They felt invincible, but that feeling would unfortunately not last. The couple were also trying to keep their lives as entertaining and exciting in their daily lives. They often free run in the crowded city center, or they take their mountain bike and take it to the rough forest terrain on the outskirts of town. But during one of these regular trips, a tragedy happened. During one of their adventures, the couple took a path they had taken 1,000 times before. It's a good way to do some cardio, but it wasn't particularly difficult for people at their level. They were just expecting a simple and quiet bike ride. But when you've done something potentially dangerous as many times as Mandy and Eric, you might become very relaxed and maybe even take your safety for granted. In the woods, a surprise can always appear out of nowhere and surprise even the most experienced cyclists and motorcyclists. Mandy came up front and Eric was standing not far behind her. She had a fast pace. But suddenly something jumped in the way just a few feet from Mandy's bike, which was still going at high speed. It was a rabbit that was now paralyzed with fear. Mandy must have acted in a split second. She moved away immediately to the right but didn't have time to look where to go. At full speed, Mandy veered out of the way into the denser woods and crashed into a tree. She flew off her bike and landed hard on the ground, hitting her head. Cyclists going into the forest should always be prepared for something like this to happen one day. Animals are all around you and risks are always present. But unfortunately, Mandy and Eric had been overconfident and weren't wearing helmets. The couple had not taken the risks seriously. Eric raced to her side in seconds. To her surprise, Mandy appears to be unconscious. Eric panicked, but noticed that she still seemed to be breathing. He quickly grabbed his phone and dialed the emergency number. But there was another problem. It took Eric a while to be able to contact anyone, as the couple was deep in the forest at this point, and there weren't very many cell towers in those places. When Eric finally managed to reach someone, he asked them to come quickly but was told that it was not possible. Indeed, the help could not penetrate into the forest so deeply, at least not fast enough. Eric should take Mandy out of the forest to find them in a less dense part of the woods. He left the bikes, picked Mandy up in his arms, and managed to carry her in his arms for almost 15 minutes straight. All the while, Eric didn't feel tired. Adrenaline surged through his body and all he could do was think of the love of his life who lay motionless in his arms. He ran as fast as he could until he reached the edge of the forest where help was waiting for him. When he arrived in front of the ambulance, they immediately started giving first aid to Mandy as the ambulance raced across the road to the nearest hospital. They managed to stabilize her and keep her out of danger, but they very quickly had sad news for Eric. Paramedics waited to say anything to Eric until they reached the hospital and Mandy was admitted. Mandy was still conscious at the time. When she was rushed out of the ambulance, Eric heard the news that would shatter her life to pieces. Mandy had fallen into a coma that Mandy might not wake up from for a while or at all. They could already tell Eric from experience that they could keep Mandy alive in the hospital, but they couldn't wake her up without risking serious complications. Eric was stunned waiting for this. The first thing he did was call Mandy's parents. The news was met with hysterical tears from her mother and anger from her father. Anger aimed at him. Her father blamed her for putting his daughter in danger by doing this, and he told her that he had always warned them that something like this would happen one day. They immediately came to the hospital to see their daughter. Once they arrived and saw Eric outside Mandy's room where the doctors were currently working, they calmed down a bit. His father apologized for his reaction and said he knew it wasn't his fault. Then a doctor came out of Mandy's room. They could see her now. All the necessary machines had been hooked up and she was perfectly stable, but he warned them that they shouldn't expect a reaction from her, as she was currently in a deep coma. They entered the room with tears streaming down their faces. Mandy was lying on her back with her eyes closed. Her forehead was badly swollen where it hit the ground and she had clearly injured her arms, which showed signs of scratches. Her parents and Eric sat by the bed for a long time, looking and talking to Mandy, but sadly with no response in return. The doctor came back. He told them that they should go home and rest and that they would take good care of Mandy. He also informed them that they had no way of knowing when Mandy would come out of her coma. They had had cases where it was a matter of days and decades for others. Eric went home, just a 15-minute drive from the hospital. He was brought back by Mandy's parents. They also went inside with him to discuss everything that had happened and how they were going to move forward together. But at this point, they couldn't do much more than wait. Eric was supposed to go back to work the next day, but he decided to take the week off so he could spend his time in the hospital with Mandy. He also took advantage of this time to think about everything, mostly what the next few months or even years of his life would look like. He and Mandy had talked about what to do if something happened to one of them. It was always a possibility with their lifestyle. Both had always said they wanted the other to move on, but now that the time had come, Eric wasn't so sure. He couldn't imagine just leaving the love of his life like that and trying to move on. When they made those promises to each other, they had only been together for a few months, and at that time it seemed like a very logical thing to do. But now it almost seemed to him that he would not only betray Mandy by doing this, but also his parents and himself. But was it possible for him to spend maybe years of his life waiting for someone who might never wake up again? Eric made his decision on the spot. He was going to stick with Mandy. After thinking long and hard, he couldn't imagine moving on and living his life as if Mandy had never existed. She had become such a big part of his life that the least he could do for her was to wait and hope for the best. It was a difficult and long time for Eric. He spent a lot of time in the hospital hoping to see any improvement in Mandy. He often did this alongside his parents and they became very close during this time. But spending all that time in the hospital started to affect the rest of his life. He had a lot less time to do the things he and Mandy once enjoyed so much. Adventures and extreme vacations have started to become a thing of the past over time. He spent his weeks working, sitting in the hospital, and occasionally seeing friends. But it was rare. Eric also told Mandy about it, not really with the intention of getting an answer because he knew she wouldn't be happy if she heard that, but more to show her that he was with her. He also told Mandy's parents about it, but they had a very different reaction than he expected. They actually tried to motivate him to go out again, get back to the things he loved to do, and spend less time in the hospital. They loved that he remained faithful to Mandy, but they didn't think that meant having to put the rest of his life on hold. This made Eric think a lot. After much deliberation, Eric decided to take the advice of Mandy's parents to heart. He wanted to make a serious attempt to try to resume his favorite pastime. He had even planned a trip abroad to go hiking with one of his good friends, but the doubts did not leave him. At first, he was really excited about it. However, he didn't want to go back to mountain biking, but he started running again in the city. This led him to interact more with different people, and among those other people, there was a girl he had seen before. Eric had always known that this girl was interested in him. He had seen her watching him when he was free riding with Mandy. When she realized that Eric was alone this time, she immediately approached him and struck up a conversation. This girl's intentions were obvious. She was interested in Eric and didn't hesitate to let him know. She didn't know about Mandy's situation and probably assumed the couple had separated. Eric wasn't sure what to think of her advances at first, but he quickly made up his mind. Although Eric had to admit that he found this girl very attractive, he didn't find it difficult at all to refuse her advances. By then, it was clear to him that he had made the right decision in remaining loyal to Mandy. But this realization did not happen overnight for Eric. It wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't interested in anyone other than Mandy, and even his hobbies just weren't the same. He was so used to doing all these activities with her, and now being around other people didn't suit him. This allowed him to validate his decision to put everything on hold. But was it really the right decision? By now, more than 5.5 years had passed without any response from Mandy, and Eric and Mandy's parents were starting to lose more and more hope. The doctors also seemed to have made it clear to them for a while, but now they had finally started to take in the reality. But something amazing happened. During a daily reaction test, Mandy showed very slight movement which appeared to be a reaction to the test. The doctor tried several more times, and the fourth time it happened again. He immediately called Eric. Eric was ecstatic, but the doctor tempered his enthusiasm. It was no guarantee that she would wake up soon, and he couldn't even assure her that she would wake up at all. But it was a first sign that there was hope, and if she continued to have the same reaction, they might start to move on a little more. Over the next 2 weeks, Mandy's reactions to stimuli became much more frequent and strong. Each additional test they attempted had had the desired effect, and the doctors were becoming more and more optimistic. Was there finally a real glimmer of hope? Eric now spent almost all of Mandy's waking moments with her in the hospital. He waited and hoped. It had been 6 years since he had heard Mandy's voice or seen her beautiful blue eyes. He couldn't wait another day to finally be reunited with her. But Eric could never have imagined how this reunion would end up unfolding. 6 weeks after Mandy first reacted to the reaction test, it finally happened. She opened her eyes. Eric was in the hospital at the time, and Mandy's parents had left barely an hour ago. The nurse who was in the room with Eric immediately called them. Tears streamed down Eric's face. Mandy looked very dazed and confused as to where she was. Eric started explaining everything to her. He had to take it easy because it was obvious that Mandy was very weak. But she seemed to start remembering little by little. And by everything, we mean everything. First, she remembered who Eric was and she seemed happy to see him. It should be kept in mind that for her, time did not seem to have passed for all these years. Mandy must have felt like she saw him before she fell asleep and saw him now when she woke up, but that was going to make what happened next even stranger. Eric went on to tell her how she fell into a coma and he got her to the hospital just in time. Mandy listened to all of this with wide eyes, but her expression changed when Eric told her she had been there for 6 years. Her surprise suddenly seemed to turn to anger. It took her a while to figure out the situation, but once she made peace with that reality, she suddenly got angry at Eric. She even started crying uncontrollably. Eric was perplexed by this confusion. He thought she would be happy to see him, but she couldn't even look him in the eye. When Mandy calmed down a bit, she was able to explain to him why she had become so enraged. She couldn't believe Eric had been waiting for her all this time, that he wasted his best years just sitting in a hospital bed waiting for her. She felt incredibly guilty for taking all that time away from him and was angry that he had broken their promise. Eric just looked into her eyes for a moment without saying a word. Then he kissed Mandy. Although Mandy hesitated for maybe a second, she couldn't help but hug him with what little strength she had. Both were crying. When Mandy's parents arrived, they still hadn't let go. Mandy had never really been mad and she was actually glad Eric had waited for her. She just felt incredibly guilty, but Eric never regretted his decision for a single second. Mandy has managed to make a full recovery and the two are still very happy together, even trying to go back to their extreme lifestyle.